Welcome to C is for Columbia, episode 12, where we talk about life, the world, things going on in the world, and things you may not have heard about on other podcasts or other news media outlets. And he is going to go ahead and start us off, so Sam, take it away.
Yeah, hey, so got a good show for us today. First thing I want to bring up, a Common Dreams article. Democrats are proposing a debt ceiling reform act to prevent future Republican Party hostage taking when the debt ceiling comes up, as it always does. As a result of the Republican Party continuing to hold the economy hostage in order to obtain spending cuts, Democratic lawmakers are introducing legislation to reform to prevent this from happening again. House Budget Committee ranking member Brendan Boyle, a Democrat from Pennsylvania, and Senate Majority Whip Dick Durbin, a Democrat from Illinois, have introduced a bill called the Debt Ceiling Reform Act. Boyle and Durbin's legislation would authorize the U.S. Treasury Department to continue paying the nation's bills unless within 30 days both chambers pass a veto-proof resolution of disapproval. So to summarize that a bit better, the idea is that it would allow the U.S. Treasury Department to continue paying the nation's bills regardless of anything the Republican Party tries to do. We've seen in the past, they won't allow the debt ceiling to be raised unless certain cuts to various federal programs are enacted. I thought I'd bring this up because we just had quite the show, as usual, regarding the debt ceiling. It has been a Republican strategy for a while to be able to pass spending cuts to go ahead and have the debt ceiling raised. It kind of creates a contentious issue because obviously there would be large economic consequences if the debt ceiling wasn't raised. And Republicans know the Democrats will be willing to compromise with them as they have historically to prevent, that type of situation from occurring. And as a result of that, the Republicans have been able to essentially take hostage and, pass certain spending cuts that Democrats otherwise may not approve of in order to authorize the debt ceiling being raised. So this is a pretty interesting bill. It's unclear to me how far it will go in terms of actually being able to pass. But this is something we could see more of in the future in terms of, what kind of progressive reforms might come to prevent these, hostage situations whenever it's time to, raise the debt ceiling, essentially. What are your thoughts, Ted, on this bill?
Well, okay, it's interesting to me. Is the bill framed specifically as preventing Republican hostage taking on the economy? Like, that's how it's framed?
Yeah, that's the intent. And it does come, shortly after we had another one of our debt ceiling debates. It's something we've seen a lot of, especially since Obama's first term, is, we need to raise the debt ceiling. There's economic consequences if we don't raise the debt ceiling. But, the Tea Party and the Trump Republicans aren't going to, allow the Democrats to pass the debt ceiling raise until, they cut certain bills.
Right, I
so
get
that is the intent.
They're trying to cut, and they did. They tried to get spending cuts in with increasing the debt ceiling, right? I mean, you could frame it as that's a hostage taking. I see that as a bargaining chip. Obviously, there are huge economic consequences, and both sides know that. But I see that then as more of a bargaining chip than like hostage taking. Maybe those are kind of two in the same. One person's bargaining chip is another person's you're taking the economy hostage sort of situation. But in my mind, while that was all going on, in my mind, I just felt that it was inevitable that something's going to pass. There's going to be a bunch of compromises in it. There's going to be a bunch of tax cuts in it. Or not tax cuts, spending cuts in it. And it's going to pass regardless. Like, it was down to the wire. It appeared down to the wire. What was it, the last Saturday that it was before that consequences started coming out? Biden signed the bill. Is that right?
Yeah,
That was
yeah,
last
very
Saturday, right?
recently.
Yeah. So this bill that you're proposing, I want to know more about it. You said 30 days. It gives 30 days after the deadline set by Congress for the Fed to continue paying off its debt. Is that right?
Correct, yes.
So why not, if that bill does pass, why doesn't that just move the goalpost 30 days forward,
Sure.
right? I mean, then they'll just hold off for another 30 days and continue to make negotiations during those 30 days.
Yeah, I mean, I totally get where you're coming from. Absolutely. Like, it could be just a moving the goalpost situation. I guess, like, on a positive way of looking at it, like, it would at least give some, like, bare amount of we don't have to have this anxiety
Well,
attack
okay,
every
yeah.
year or so.
And we don't have to have that anxiety attack. The media did have a bit of an anxiety attack. They always have some form of anxiety attack about some deadline. Okay, during government shutdowns, which is a slightly different related thing. That's on passing a budget. And then there's government shutdown, and the government shutdown lasts however long, and the consequences for that go on and on. That seems like a similar situation where we know that a budget must eventually be passed, and the outward appearance of a government shutdown and all the consequences from that look severe to the public in order to put pressure on the lawmakers to compromise, right? So, and this seems, at least in my opinion, it seems similar, just with much more drastic consequences if the debt ceiling was not extended. You know, I suppose it is a larger, more looming consequence than a government shutdown, but I don't see how it's fundamentally different than passing the budget. Um, in the sense that it's supposed to be this big display that we put on when the Democrats and Republicans have a chance to, use the power of the purse to their political leverage. And I don't know, is it true that the Republicans are usually the ones who are stymieing the debt ceiling? Historically, does that happen?
I'd say especially since Obama's first term, there has been some history here. Now, the thing is, this is kind of nuanced because it's hard to discern to a certain extent how much of this is rhetoric,
As with
how
anything,
much
yeah.
of this is like, a strategy issue. And then maybe there are a few ideologues that seriously don't want to
Yeah.
raise the debt ceiling, but their numbers are very little. So I mean, yeah, there's a lot of ways you could kind of look at it back and forth. I think with a bill like this, I mean, if it were to pass, I don't think this would completely solve from the Democrats' perspective the issue entirely. Yeah, and it's a reform. But I mean, yeah, I do bring this up just because we had a pretty contentious debt ceiling situation. And I think especially on the Republican side, you have a very weak Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. Uh,
Yes. Yeah.
there's a lot of people within the congressional Republicans that want to remove him. And I think he has to kind of play ball to a certain extent with a more hard line, make America great again, Republicans, in order to keep his power. So I do wonder how much of it. I think, like McCarthy, I think in a literal sense wanted to get the debt ceiling raised, and he's a little bit more like moderate and pragmatic. But from his perspective, just in terms, not even just in terms of this bill, but like the debt ceiling fiasco itself, he was in a position where he had to posture to an extent and make sure he didn't fall out of favor with the more hardline members of the Republican Party. And I think to an extent, maybe he accomplished that.
Yeah, I only heard praising as far as his handling went of that debt ceiling. I didn't hear too many people lamenting how he handled it. At least from within the Republican Party. And even some of the more liberal media outlets were praising how he handled it. Uh, so I think he got high marks on that. But you're right, he is in a contentious position with his seat as the House leader, the House Speaker, excuse me.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's just like that issue alone could be like an entirely another topic, which we can cover, of course.
But as far as this bill goes, in summary, don't really see how it does that much the way you've described it to me. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I could research it a little bit more. But if all it is allowing the Fed to, for 30 days after the deadline, to continue paying off debt, they're just going to use that new deadline as the bargaining chip and play, along those terms, along that 30-day line, rather than using their own deadline that they set. So I don't really see how it accomplishes much as you framed it. Maybe there's more in it that I'm missing, or maybe they're just trying to milk it for all it's worth, trying to say, the Republicans are playing a dangerous game, and we need to stop them playing this dangerous game. Maybe that's what their angle is.
Moving on to the next topic, Illinois has adopted new LGBTQ plus protections. They're passing a law that's intended to help queer people in foster care and make sure their rights are being protected, but also to make it easier for same-sex couples to get married. The law will also restrict the ability to ban transgender individuals from participating in various sports. So, a lot to cover there. In terms of basically, I think a lot of Democrats do have the mindset that, especially with a loaded Supreme Court in favor of the conservatives, that gay marriage, for instance, which is part of what this bill is protecting, is, gay rights are to a certain extent under attack from their perspective. And I think we're going to see a lot. And the reason why I brought this up originally is because I think we're going to see a lot of this on the local level now in blue states, is because Democrats don't feel confident that gay marriage is, good to go and safe. And, I also mentioned transgender sports, which has become a really contentious issue. It's highly debated in terms of, should transgender people be able to participate on sports teams with the gender they identify as. And I bring this up because I think we're going to see a lot more of this on a local level. And I do wonder, depending what direction the country goes in the next few years, are we going to have kind of a situation sort of with legalization of marijuana, where the conservative states outlaw it and the liberal states, allow it? And are we going to see kind of something similar to that with gay marriage? Is it possible gay rights and transgender rights in conservative states, and even on an executive level, if the Republicans do regain power of the executive branch, there may be a bigger divide, I think, from conservative and liberal states. And I think you are going to see, like we're seeing in Illinois, more bills being passed to kind of go the extra mile to protect the rights of gay, queer, trans individuals.
Sure.
Illinois obviously leans Democrat, especially with Chicago, so they're able to pass these type of laws. You might not see a law passed like this in Texas or, North Dakota, I meant to say, more conservative leaning states. So this is kind of like my prediction here is we're going to start seeing sort of two Americas when it comes to social issues. We're going to kind of see a trend where liberal states feel that they need to pass legislation to protect the rights of gay and transgender individuals. And then, we'll see kind of the opposite with that, in conservative states. So I think this is going to be a trend we see. Good for Illinois for making it easier for same-sex couples to get married. That's something that has a lot of public support. About 71% of Americans support gay marriage. So there is going to be a definite divide there, I think, going forward.
Well, for sure. I think we've seen a lot of cultural divide within America along, you could say, party lines or social issue lines, like queer issues, abortion being one of them. Lots of those issues create contention and division and can become tools within a quote-unquote culture war. I don't want to insinuate that there is a culture war going on, but certainly there is a need rhetorically speaking, to build up animosity and build up support on particular issues. And those issues gain momentum very well. And I think that politicians know that they have to use them in certain ways. So I see the Illinois bill. You're saying that Illinois is passing a bill to allow for trans youth or trans people to compete in the sport in the gender of the sport of their choosing. Is that what I'm gathering?
So the idea is it doesn't explicitly do that, but the general idea is it restricts the abilities of schools and organizations to prevent transgender people from participating in said sports. That's kind of the more like technical legal way to look at it in a literal sense. And it's going to be, I mean, this has been a hot button issue for a while. Ron DeSantis has kind of championed the conservative perspective of this. And, you know, if he ends up being the nominee, this probably will be something that gets brought up on a national level a lot more. And I guess what Democrats are trying to do with this bill, and maybe bills similar to this in other states, is let's say, you know, we do have a president, Ron DeSantis, and he tries to pass
Huh.
legislation on the executive level, whether it's, you know, makes it more difficult for same-sex couples to get married, transgender individuals to participate in
Oh,
sports.
okay.
The point I'm kind of getting at is I think
I see. I see.
we're getting to a point where a lot of more liberal states are going to pass legislation like this, so they're not affected by the Supreme
Hmm.
Court or the president, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, yeah, I see what you mean by the Supreme Court being that it has a conservative tilt. It's known to have a conservative tilt, so more liberal states are going to take more. They're going to exercise their states' rights, is what they're going to do. They're going to exercise much more liberal policies within their state in order to, one, signal the fact that they are a safe haven for these particular groups, and that these particular groups will not be kept from exercising their own civil liberties as they would. I mean, that's how they're going to frame it. Whether you think that uh, trans athletes should be allowed to compete in the gender of their choice, like, I don't know. That's part of the culture war issue, is whether or not that is the moral or correct thing to do. But certainly the states can exercise their own agenda in order to further those sorts of things. Same thing like within Florida, like Ron DeSantis, like you mentioned, and he shooting down trans youth, trans individuals from competing in sports within the gender of their choice, the gender that they identify as. It seems like a whole lot of noise to me. I don't really see how it will produce anything pragmatic, anything meaningful in even the world of sports. Or we're talking about bathrooms, whether to segregate bathrooms or not. All the segregation talk, it's very similar to a civil rights sort of segregation talk. Whether or not segregating by gender in certain circumstances is the morally correct thing to do, or whether it is repugnant and toxic, that's going to come up to almost a religious point on both sides, in my opinion. And but whether or not you believe that we should segregate by gender or shouldn't segregate by gender or should allow people to choose their own gender, I do think that it's an issue that we're going to hear about for a long time to come.
Absolutely. I want to bring up another story that I thought was interesting. So, this is in regards to gun control. California Governor Gavin Newsom is proposing a 28th Amendment with the intention on curbing gun violence in America. The amendment would raise the minimum age to purchase a gun from 18 to 21, mandate universal background checks, and institute what's considered a reasonable waiting period for all gun purchases. Ultimately, also preventing civilians from purchasing assault weapons. Now, when I say propose, this is more of a rhetorical proposition because Gavin Newsom can't actually do this, but it is more of a policy idea that we should propose the 28th Amendment. We've talked about gun control and, some of the issues there on the show before. I've never really covered the idea of adding a new amendment to the Constitution. The only amendment we have about gun control in the Constitution is the Second Amendment, which was basically stating that all citizens have the right to bear arms. Conservatives are a lot of times very passionate about yeah, don't tread on me, basically. And, the idea of, because, Gavin Newsom, this is someone who, while isn't running for president right now, may run for president in the future. He's a relatively young governor of California, young by presidential standards, of course, but uh, middle-aged, essentially. That's young when you run for president. But yeah, I mean, the idea of adding a 28th Amendment, I mean, it seems very unrealistic to me that this is something we'd actually be able to accomplish. But I mean, some of these ideas, banning assault weapons, raising the age to buy a gun, background checks, many people wouldn't necessarily consider some of these proposals to be all that unreasonable. I think especially with background checks, there are plenty of people who like the idea of having, background checks for having a gun. I don't know that it's realistic that we can propose a new amendment to the Constitution. That would be very difficult to accomplish, but it is an idea. It's a very bold idea from a it's a bold idea from a potential presidential hopeful, Gavin Newsom. I think ultimately, and we have talked about this, like I said before, gun culture in America is very different than gun culture in many other countries. It's something that Americans tend to be very prideful about. Uh, almost to an extent where it actually becomes prideful to a fault. I've said before, like I support. I mean, I've never been like a huge anti-gun person. I'm not. I'm more sympathetic to the idea of banning assault weapons, which this has been a very contentious issue. Also, the idea of banning assault weapons. I've always been in favor of owning a gun for self-defense. Um, but I mean, I guess what I would say ultimately here is, I'm guessing the 28th Amendment isn't going to stick, but I mean, I think this is going to be a pretty big issue in the coming election next year, as gun violence is still kind of getting out of control. The millennial generation and Generation Z essentially grew up with the idea that we're not as safe as we think we are, and it could happen to any of us. So I don't know. I mean, where do we go from here? Like, I mean, I guess we could try to put a 28th Amendment in the Constitution, but the gun control crowd from the progressive left. I mean, would this be their best option potentially to pass meaningful gun law reforms?
Going through the Constitution, I do not think is the most meaningful way to pass gun control reforms at all. Like you said, a constitutional amendment is probably not going to happen anytime soon. And as we mentioned earlier in this show, the Supreme Court does have a conservative tilt at the moment and will probably continue to do so for some time. So any interpretations of the Constitution are probably going, with regards to gun control, are going to lead in favor of guns in general. I think that the best way, personally, for Democrats to target gun control and hit on gun control is to look at from where this notion comes from and from where these politicians that do advocate so strongly for open access to guns come from. Look towards gun lobbies and point the finger at gun lobbying. People are a lot less sympathetic towards gun lobbies and the NRA, these large firms that take up a lot of political weight and move a lot of the pieces around, politically speaking, in order to get their agendas through. If they were to focus on those, and there is some focus on those, but focusing on those gun lobbies would create a much stronger sense of animosity, I think, towards those gun lobbies and towards gun ownership, not as an individual thing, but now as a lobbying issue. And that I think would work a lot better in fact than focusing on mass shootings. I honestly don't think that people care too much about mass shootings anymore, and that sounds really bad. But I don't. And what I mean by it though is that a mass shooting happening does not incite much hostility anymore. It doesn't really ignite anything in people anymore. People have already made up their minds on how they feel about mass shootings, and they know that mass shootings are going to continue to happen. And you mentioned assault weapons. What a conservative would say is that assault weapons have been and are banned. You know, they have their own definition of an assault weapon, which is a fully automatic, particular calibers, particular magazine sizes. There is a whole mess of legislation around the magazine sizes and mag sizes of particular weapons, and all that does, it seems like that's political chatter trying to get particular issues, edge cases in through one way or another, when in reality the Constitution and the Supreme Court act as this big huge buffer, similar to how Roe v. Wade acted as this huge buffer, with states legislating around Roe v. Wade. And once Roe v. Wade was thrown up, then all this other legislation poured out, and you have a mess of abortion wackiness going on. And a lot of the times that's kind of what happens in the American system when something in the federal government fundamentally changes, like Roe v. Wade getting thrown out, or like this Gavin Newsom's proposing a constitutional amendment. You're going to see tons of mess devolve out of that. But the realistic prospect of passing a constitutional amendment, either through a constitutional convention or a congressional passing of it, it's a huge hurdle to overcome to pass a constitutional amendment. So I don't think it's very realistic. But like you said, it's very bold. And if he's looking to maybe, like you said, he's kind of young. If he's looking to maybe cement himself as a bold strategist for a federal office like the presidency, maybe it's a good move. I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, I will go back to that point a little bit too. Like, I get the impression that Gavin Newsom is somebody that has presidential ambitions. I think he does want to run for president at some point of time, and you know, he may even be a strong candidate. Potentially, he's definitely politically savvy. Probably not the most progressive option if you're more of a, you know, Bernie Sanders person or AOC person. You know, he's still kind of like rank and file establishment Democrat, but this could like be more of a political tool in terms of Gavin Newsom trying to get more of a reputation, making bold promises, or at the very least, you know, endorsing bold strategy. So there could be that aspect of it, and I definitely think we'll see a lot more of Gavin Newsom in the future, you know, as we go on. But yeah, you know, in conclusion, we had like a pretty good show. We talked about you know, the debt ceiling reform, not just the policy being proposed, but also kind of the back and forth in terms of you know, this fiasco that we just recently settled, you know, regarding the debt ceiling, you know, gay rights and transgender rights in Illinois, and of course, this 28th Amendment. So, you know, a lot to talk about. We are getting in a
Yes,
little
we
bit
are.
closer to the 2024 election. In a few months, there will be, you know, primary debates, and we really look forward to covering those. I'm really interested. We kind of discussed on the last show the Democratic Party won't be having any debates, and we spent time talking about Williamson and Kennedy, but obviously a lot's going on. Chris Christie has entered the race and he's criticized Trump. Mike Pence has entered the race and he's also criticized
No
Trump, especially for the
surprise.
January 6th.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll definitely have more information about that as we go on.
Oh, it's gonna be a fun one.
It's going to be a fun one. I think little prediction. I think Chris Christie will outperform in the 2024 primaries.
Wow,
I
that
think
is quite a
he will
prediction.
outperform. I'm not necessarily saying he'll beat Trump, but I think
Sure,
people
sure.
are a little asleep about him, and I think
People are counting out
they are.
Christie. Don't count
They
out
are, and
Christie.
here's the thing: Christie, he's from New Jersey. He's Sicilian. He can get angry, and I think he has a lot to be angry about, given how Trump treated him after everything Christie did for him. So I think we're gonna have some pretty interesting debate moments between Trump and Christie. That's my
What do you
prediction.
think about that as a slogan? Don't count out Christie.
You might want to sell it to him. He could make a little money.
All right. Well, if Chris Christie's listening, I hope he reaches out. And I hope everyone out there listening had a great time listening to us. So be sure to like, subscribe, comment, share this with your friends, share this with Governor Chris Christie. Let him hear our ideas, let him know our thoughts, and we'll see you next time.